So I'm pleased to welcome John Slyce. John is a writer and critic living here with us in London. He has written extensively on the work of Sarah Sze, Gillian Wearing, Sarah Jones, David Shrigley, Darren Almond, Michael Landy, Carey Young, Cullinan and Richards, Ruppersberg, Rodney Graham, Pipilotti Rist, Charles Avery, and Becky Beasley, and regularly contributes essays, reviews, and interviews to major art magazines and journals. He is a tutor in fine art at the Royal College of Art and a senior lecturer in the master's program in modern contemporary art and art world practice at Christie's Education. Thank you. Please join me. Welcome, John Slyce.
This is the testing for the moment. I don't really like to. I can't bear to sit down and talk. There's something that happens to my kind of thinking when I sit down as well. It's probably an occupational hazard for being a writer. So I'm happier standing up and moving to speak, which is what I'll try to do today, as long as I don't stray too far from the microphone. The title tonight, Contemporary with What? It comes from a rather pointed question that was put to me by a remarkably old Danish architect when I was responding to a question he asked, what do you do? And I said that I write about contemporary art. And he very correctly asked me, contemporary with what? Because it was the 90s and we had already kind of slipped into this mode of thinking the contemporary as a term that transcends history, but dangerously also the social. And I can't say that I've worried tremendously about the contemporary or even contemporary art since. What I have missed is a sense of the postmodern. And part of what I'd like to argue tonight is that the contemporary is effectively an extension or a translation of postmodernism by another name. And perhaps a kind of rather romantic sleight of hand in doing so. But I've sent you far too many readings, which are at once both a kind of background of some of the things I'm going to say tonight, but also foreground, in that they go beyond the scope of what I'm going to talk about. I'm a product, in a sense, of the 60s and early 70s, and that very much I share with the contemporary, because the contemporary is a kind of term or notion, concept, comes out of that self-same kind of period, and therefore is connected with all the implosions, deaths, and avoidances, and acceptances and embraces of certain kind of political agendas and activism common to that period. The kind of, in my mind, the closest questioning on the contemporary came out of a questionnaire that was the brainchild of Hal Foster and circulated through October's mailing list in 2009, a questionnaire on the contemporary. And you have in the little handouts, you've got a small extract, which is about a 50th of the response that came into October. The extract, by all means, gathers up much of the best. A lot of it was disciplinary kind of turf war between art history and what they were proposing as a contemporary art history. I did not, nor would I ever study art history as a discipline. I studied history and critical theory, and art history, for all the wonders of the New Art History or T.J. Clark or anyone else you care to mention, art history is still fundamentally waiting on its kind of Hayden White figure, right? Someone who kind of takes apart the discipline, but also breaks down kind of how the discipline finds its identity. What I did really spend my time doing was what was still a little provocative within historical studies, which was contemporary history. And by contemporary history, it was history kind of reaching back 25 to 30 years, which in the 1980s was, early 80s was somewhat provocative. It's no longer provocative, it's no longer even called contemporary history. At the time, it was called contemporary history because there was a fear that it might lose its identity and cross over into political sociology or political science even. Now, in the Questionnaire on the Contemporary, in kind of reading back through it, I found a nice video piece by Mary Batiste, which is her response to the questionnaire, which I'd like to play for you now. But then as a kind of segue into some of the things I want to talk about tonight, we'll go back and read a response by Pam Lee. Here's a little video intro.
This trajectory begins with an article. What is the contemporary? Surely it is everything that is of the now, even when narrowed to the category of a heart. I was disappointed with the responses. The other suffix I had missed was history. Contemporary was contemporary art history. A narrow academic cul-de-sac. The only reply I care to repeat was from Mi Won Kwon. The category, I quote, is as self-consciously a para-art history, para from the Greek meaning beside, but also used in certain combinations, meaning to be amiss or irregular, denoting alterations and modifications. I'm speaking this through the vessel of moving image, so everything I say is frozen in time. Suppose as an artist, you might analyze your malaise of frustration through word association, art world association. And so on. It strikes me that we could consider contemporary art history in general as a para-art history, with an extended understanding of para, to include the parasitic. Contemporary art history as hanger-on, leech, freeloader, bloodsucker, sponge, bottom feeder, mooch on the proper body of art history. I am most interested in destroying the category of contemporary art history as it is becoming consolidated.
Foster's questionnaire went out with the kind of list of questions to which Vaughn's response is partial. And then we'll take a look at Pam Lee's response. Foster writes, the category of contemporary art is not a new one. What is new is the sense that, in its very heterogeneity, much present practice seems to float free of historical determination, conceptual definition, and critical judgment. Such paradigms as the neo-avant-garde and postmodernism, which once oriented some art and theory, have run into the sand, and arguably no models of much explanatory reach or intellectual force have risen in their stead. At the same time, perhaps paradoxically, contemporary art has become an institutional object in its own right. In the academic world, there are professorships and programs, and in the museum world, departments and institutions all devoted to the subject. And most tend to treat it as apart, not only from pre-war practice, but from most post-war practice as well. Is this floating free real or imagined? A merely local perception, a simple effect of the end of grand narratives? If it is real, how can we specify some of its principal causes, that is, beyond general reference to the market and globalization? Or is it indeed a direct outcome of a neoliberal economy, one that, moreover, is now in crisis? What are some of its salient consequences for artists, critics, curators, and historians, for their formation and their practice alike? Are there collateral effects in other fields of art history? Are there instructive analogies to be drawn from the situation in other arts and disciplines? Finally, are there benefits to this apparent lightness of being? Lightness of being is, of course, a kind of reference to Kundera and his own unbearable lightness of being. Many of Foster's questions already suggest an answer which he could have supplied very easily. But one of the best, which strangely Foster leaves out his extracts, which I circulated to you, the passage he leaves out, is from Pam Lee, who's working from within the discipline, but also quite skeptical about it, the discipline of art history, that is. And she writes here, though there's no space to elaborate the point, let me suggest that we have yet to wrestle fully with the problem of postmodernism in our account of the contemporary. This is not at all to endorse the revival of the term postmodernism, much less redeem its associated artists and themes after the fact, so much as to think about postmodernism historically in our deliberations on contemporary art. Maybe we've too quickly exiled postmodernism to the dustbin of theory's history without treating that relegation in any systematic way as function and symptom of the very condition much writing on the topic was alleged to diagnose in the first place. Lee, for me, kind of immediately strikes at an answer to the problem, or a problem of the contemporary, but does so from a really specific point that postmodernism really understood far too late, which was there was always already a kind of postmodernism of the right, but also postmodernism of the left. Now the left, kind of left postmodernism had very distinct blindnesses, one of which was a kind of, I would say, a kind of fixation on a technological kind of utopian sublime, the freedom of the internets, of the digital, of that kind of hyper kind of space connectivity, which very quickly ran flat. The other kind of weakness, which gives postmodernism over far too easily to the contemporary for me, is that of a kind of stylistic imperative, that very quickly it became a choice, particularly in art practice, of not only a way of thinking and conception of the work, but a style, which was its fundamental weakness, because styles one can buy into or not. Whereas a kind of understanding of postmodernism, which I was there was in a sense no choice, because it belonged to kind of fundamental logic, fundamental cultural logic of the world in which we find ourselves, in a particular period known as late capitalism, which has very specific characteristics as far as both culture and economy. Culture expands and becomes, in a sense, coterminous with economy. So whenever you hear the word culture, you reach for your checkbook. Whenever you hear the word economy, you think culture. Basically meaning that everything is made visible, everything is enunciated, and everything is offered up for consumption. Now those symptoms or characteristics are the primary characteristics of the contemporary, right? With its very distinct commodity status, which promises immediate consumption. Right? Those of you who've just been through Frieze will realize you don't even have to buy it. It is immediately consumed without any sort of resistance whatsoever. It's almost, Adorno once had a lovely little metaphor about the dialectic of enlightenment, which was, it was a bit like the diner where you sat down to order, and then you placed your order, and then they delivered the menu. These are some of the signal moments for me in the kind of the rise of the contemporary. They belong as well to the kind of manifesta biennale kind of mode or moment. This is Keynotes de Gaulle. This is a shot, not a kind of documentary shot from the piece, but just the backstage around the side of the German pavilion of rehearsals about to go on from the elder actors that were hired to perform This Is So Contemporary over and over and over again, only announcing the fact that it was contemporary. This is an interesting historical document which comes from the most recent period of the Biennale in Venice, which is the Prada Foundation, their restaging of When Attitudes Become Form. This is Harold Schemann's little play with the words that are coming up through the conversations with artists. It was, in a sense, the rubric for at least half of the title. Live in your head when attitudes become form. And an image from the original work, which was effectively absent from the restaging. That kind of act of restaging when attitudes become form, for me, really encapsulates the kind of historical vacuum that goes with that sort of contemporary restaging. I mean, it's not. Its apparent subject appears to be history and historical excursion, if not kind of representation of the original. Whereas the only real kind of moments of historical excavation happen in the wings, in the kind of documentary vitrines holding material, or in the film that was made the first time around during the installation. This is another early Biennale moment for me, and I can remember when I encountered this Sam Durant on a painting script light box in the Arsenale, and I felt like, man, I was really tired moving through the kind of the gauntlet of it all. And it's only recently that I was able to not excavate the kind of resources that the painting drew on for literally the sign, what stood behind the sign, which originally was a civil rights kind of documentary photographing the civil rights march. Like a man, I'm tired of waiting, which then kind of adds exactly the historical, social frame of that waiting and the tiredness. The sign next to that Durant borrowed from, liberty for all or death for America. This we mean. Part of my own kind of work at the moment is a little bit of a kind of Quisling historical resurrection of a journal called The Fox, a very short-lived journal that was around for a little over about a year and a half, and was the product of what was known at the time as Art and Language New York, the New York wing of Art and Language. And was, the editorial team was kind of led initially by Joseph Kosuth, and Carl Beveridge, and Ian Byrne, Sarah Charlesworth, and Michael Corris, and Andrew Bernard. And if you're familiar with the journal Art Language, coming out of the UK, the Fox stood very much in another kind of camp to that journal, in that it was very social, very openly political, and also represented a much broader church voices coming into it. So there was a tremendous amount of dissent and self-criticism that came out of the center of the content of the magazine. The magazine only runs for 3 issues before the whole project implodes. Interestingly, because there was a particularly heated attack on Donald Judd, included in issue number 3, and because Kosuth had aligned himself very much with Judd in this kind of medium-sized dry good kind of production, Judd had a real go at Kosuth, and Kosuth had to kind of distance himself from it, but then there was kind of internecine kind of fighting as well. This is issue 2, and in November, in a couple of weeks' time, in Unit Pit Projects in Vancouver, my partner in the project, which is Arnaud Desjardins. Arnaud is an artist who also runs something called the Everyday Press. We're going to show a kind of exploded view of the Fox in Vancouver, and in very much, in a not dissimilar mode to tonight, but much more of a workshop kind of mode. We're going to circulate readings and get feedback from artists in the area, but also Emily Carr, and try and test the kind of contemporary kind of meaning, import, relevancy of some of that political content. 75, 76 is a moment that is a kind of post-bubble moment in the art world. There's still a lot of petrodollars floating around, and art is particularly what then is referred to as contemporary art, really contemporary in a kind of shared, projected unity of time and place. There's a lot of interest in it, and part of the thrust of the Fox was to resist that easy adoption. Now, what Arnaud and I have done is, it's slightly in a similar vein to things like printed information, some of the Ubu Web, some of the sites you might be familiar with that put these kind of historical documents back into circulation. But what we've done is slightly different in that, for the moment, and our intentions are only to kind of reissue a kind of near facsimile of the magazine, not a kind of fetish facsimile, but we're adopting a similar kind of quality to the cheap newsprint paper and kind of cardboard covers to the magazine. And we're inviting a kind of similar kind of response. This is the kind of editorial masthead which was sent out, which you may have been hopefully reading. But this is our initial statement at the top, which the ultimate aim of Re the Fox, which is the name of the show that will be in Vancouver, is to produce as a form of live historical bootlegging, where authenticity is not a marketable gimmick, but a political problem of transmission from one generation to the next. And then we borrow the editorial statement from issue 1 of the Fox. If you're concerned with trying to reclaim art as an instrument of social and cultural transformation, and exposing the domination of the culture administrative apparatus, as well as art which indolently reflects that apparatus, you're urged to participate in this journal. Its editorial thrust is ideological. It aims at a contribution to the wider movement of social criticism transformation. Our contribution will be on the art front, but by no means limited to the fixed content closure of art. We need a broad social base in positive opposition to the ideological content and social relations reproduced by digital culture. Those of you wishing to participate should send correspondence to, not Canal Street, but Pender Street, Vancouver. And we'll see what happens. I mean, the Fox was a point of conversation between Arnaud and myself. And I was constantly reminded of the Fox in East London because there is a Quisling kind of van that drives around East London. It's like a courier van or something. And on the side of it, it reads The Fox, right, with a little picture of the Fox. And the Fox was something that it was familiar to me from my time in New York before I came to London. But I could rarely, if ever, find anyone who shared a similar kind of interest in it here. And it's actually not very difficult to get your hands on, or even very expensive as far as the originals. You can get the complete set for around about £150 of the vintage kind of originals. And our reprint will hopefully cover the costs incurred in printing, but nothing more. But there is still a resistance, even though it's seemingly available. There's a resistance, in a sense, to look at it, to return to it. In a sense, we feel because it's a bit too hot, and it's a bit too also near, in a sense, our moment, or we feel that it is, given what's at stake and what are the current kind of institutional kind of requirements of our times. Ian Byrne, you have the Ian Byrne piece from Volume 1, circulated. Now, my recent thinking, and it was kind of reading and thinking that was going on before Mark ever invited me to come to the talk, was another kind of pet project of kind of following Peter Osborne in reading, if not institutionally. There was a brief period where I was at Middlesex while Osborne was still there, but we were kind of lodged in different departments and on different campuses. But then Osborne's department was dissolved at Middlesex, and he winds up at Kingston, and then produces a kind of a huge outpouring of literature and, in a sense, kind of research points all brilliantly lost to Middlesex. And Osborne's most recent book is really what's at stake in Anywhere and Not at All, philosophy of contemporary art, is not even the contemporary, but the contemporary is the kind of fulcrum with which he builds an argument around the fact that all art today is conceptual, right? Kind of breaking down kind of periodizing imperative of conceptual. We know conceptual to have been that which happened between 67 and 72, if you're kind of in line with the Vatican, or 65 to 75 if you're a Reformed kind of true believer, or 60 to 80 if you're a little soft, lapsed perhaps. But Osborne presses beyond that kind of periodization into the fact that it all is fundamentally conceptual now because it belongs to the contemporary and what he construes as a fiction, right? The fiction of the contemporary, which is where my kind of reading of Osborne sent me back immediately to Frederick Jameson and my kind of early days with that kind of body of writing around the postmodernism as a cultural logic. This is, after the introduction, the very first chapter in Osborne's book is, he sets out exactly the fiction of the contemporary, where he looks at effectively what are the symptoms, right? And some of the symptoms of something symptomatic is a fundamental approach of the postmodern. But Osborne looks at it as far as a notion of together in time, as a kind of fictive projection of what's important for Osborne, a speculative collectivity. And that within that speculative collectivity is grounded within what he refers to as a global transnational. Right? So you've got three periodizations within this kind of notion of contemporary art, and these exactly go back to the disciplinary kind of turf wars of art history. Art, since, and these you should all recognize as familiar book titles. Right? Art since 1945, art since the 1960s, and then art since 1989. Now, the thing about these three options of periods of the contemporary art is that they all belong to us, right? And they all fundamentally are located with us, as in the West, right? And to a degree, the former East, not the actual East, which belongs to something else now. But these conjunctures, one more kind of break with, in a sense, a kind of modernist project, and then the fall of the wall. And Osborne goes on to write about the contemporary as idea, as problem, fiction, and task, a kind of imperative to be contemporary, which sounds as much as anything like a kind of rebranding of modernism. And this all culminates in the global, transnational, or the contemporary today. Right? So within this kind of idea is this translation or extension of what I'm kind of fundamentally reading as a postmodernism, but kind of rebranded. Which asks what was the problem with the postmodern or postmodernism? Why did it need to be rebranded as something else, as another name? And what has it really been handed over to? Right? And what it's been handed over to is, in a sense, exactly that neoliberal kind of market imperative. So, with Osborne, we've got contemporary as a projection of unity onto times, right, or onto the times of living humans. The contemporary projects a single historical time of the present, right? It's a kind of futurology, and it's creative. In its kind of, it has a creative thrust in its kind of imaginary projection of a kind of timeless present. All of which feels very familiar as postmodernism. This is a series you may be familiar with by Rainer Gunnar, which we're at least getting one half of the series today. The other half looks like that. So it's one view of what you see, and then one view of what the other person sees before them as they do this. And in it is Frederick Jameson giving a lecture at UCLA on modernism, modernity, modernism, and late modernism. All of which are projects that stem out of Jameson's kind of initial work, or shift in Jameson's early work, after he writes a book called Marxism in Form. Early Jameson is very much kind of focused on Jean-Paul Sartre, and then as he begins, he's involved in a kind of study group in San Diego that involves Herbert Marcuse and very young Martha Rossler and very young Alan Sikula, where they're looking at the problem of theory, kind of activism in the social, in a kind of working, kind of reading group. Now, Jameson, in periodizing the 60s, he finds an end to the 60s around about exactly that moment of the end of conceptual art in the strictest kind of sense, 72. And he also finds its kind of origins in a kind of shift to the third world, or along kind of aligns with the kind of liberation movements, independence movements, and gains in the third world. And those kind of origins are aligned in a similar way to the origins of the contemporary, and Osborne's argument for this kind of transnational, global transnational sense. Along the national trends, it's another thing that strikes me, is that there was a brief moment post-'89 where in a lot of theory of nationalism and national identity, there were a few really interesting books that came out that posited the notion of the post-national identity. But a post-national identity before there was a contemporary or global kind of in place. But the new world order was still yet to be coined and not yet kind of in practice. Francis Fukuyama had not even announced the end of history. The kind of global neoliberal reign had not quite yet begun. But this post-national shifts to the transnational and becomes the kind of we are the world, one kind of brand, kind of identity of things. Now, in a much later moment of Jameson, and this is a nice little passage from what is still, I feel, a really important essay from Jameson on transformations of the image in postmodernity. And in kind of rereading it again around thinking through this talk, it raised the question of what is the status of the image. We look at the transformation of the image in postmodernity, which builds on heat of war and situationism and the society of the spectacle, but also the notion of the image as the kind of highest form of capital. It kind of begs the question of what's happened, what is the status of that image in the contemporary. This is a new way of thinking or conceptualizing where we're at today. It seems to me that this new situation, the reflexivity implied by the mixed media or technological works of art, is a very brief duration indeed. For as I've argued elsewhere, in this new stage, the very sphere of culture itself has expanded, becoming coterminous with market society in such a way that the cultural is no longer limited to its earlier traditional or experimental forms, but is consumed throughout daily life itself, in shopping, in professional activities, in the various, often televisual forms of leisure, in production for the market, and in the consumption of those market products, indeed in the most secret folds and corners of the quotidian. Social space is now completely saturated with the culture of the image, the utopian space of the Sardian reversal, the Foucauldian heterotopias of the unclassed and unclassifiable. All have been triumphantly penetrated and colonized. The authentic and the unsaid, in vu non dit, inexpressible alike, fully translated into the visible and cultural community. Now, what's at stake in Foster's Questionnaire is exactly the frustration that's felt in letting go of what had become through the postmodernism, postmodernist theory, a very apt, felt to be apt, and potent term for periodizing, in a sense, work and practices that would-be art historians were moving through. And the loss that is felt is a kind of loss of historicity, which, I mean, it remains to be seen. It's kind of open for discussion exactly what the contemporary, or the notion of contemporaneity, what it offers as a way of even thinking where we're at. This is a little statement which you might be familiar with, which is meant to frame, in a sense, what's going on through the series. With that, we might make it more of a discussion at that point, if you would like. I mean, for me, it was also kind of interesting that contemporary and contemporaries, other than the way we use it in our connection with art, it's kind of linguistically redundant, because one refers to having had contemporaries in the past, and the need to use it in the present tense is rarely felt, other than outside of this very specific kind of mode of contemporary art, which in a way goes back to this problem of contemporary with what?
Has it not maybe come up through a simple way of trying to resisting at a certain moment, if you would say, I'm an artist, the question often would have come up probably, what do you do? Do you do sculpture or do you paint? I just wonder if this term of simply calling something, no, I'm doing contemporary art, this can be this and that. If that's a way of kind of making this break, which comes through conceptual art in some way. So, or where have you looked into?
It might be, but then
how is it? What's from the information? When did it appear first? Before?
But that's the kind of short. When does contemporary appear? Contemporary art.
I'm asking you.
Yeah. Well, for me, one of the real kind of touchstones, things to always go back to in relation to any sort of kind of loaded, interesting term, is because it's part of my ancient formation, is Raymond Williams' a book called Keywords. And Williams doesn't even bother with contemporary and keywords. And he grapples with nearly everything else. But it's not it wasn't felt as something something to do, as late as even '83. And as a word in relation to art, contemporary happens nearly as soon as modern art is in place. So as soon as Barr makes this diagram, as soon as you have a museum of modern art, as soon as you have even modern art identified as being elsewhere, something that they aren't doing here, you have the beginnings of contemporary art societies. The Institute of Contemporary Art, at least in London, is born, belongs to you've got your choice of A, B, and C. As far as your answer, the periodization of contemporary, it's 47. So it's very much of that that immediate post-World War II kind of drawing. Contemporary art, as referred to by, say, in the pages of the Fox in 75, 76, those artists are referring to contemporary art. There is the art that they and their contemporaries are making. And they, like you, wouldn't say, I'm making sculpture, I'm making painting, because they are making art. They are making art. But it's no different than my kind of soft answer to that Danish architect, which I write on contemporary art. Contemporary with what? Contemporary. The problem with contemporary art is it's not art of here and now. What does it in fact refer to? And that's where I do kind of buy Osborne's argument with this fiction of the contemporary, that it is this kind of speculative collectivity projected into this global, transnational, kind of one big brand. And he makes an attempt to kind of rescue something other in its imaginative, kind of drive by focusing in on practices like the Atlas Group. It's the way fictions can be organized in a way of kind of building up some sort of return, kind of re-engagement with historical kind of forces and material. But for every Atlas Group, you have a Bernadette Corporation who's using fiction in a very different kind of mode, it seems to me. You can't just say, I am an artist, or I do stuff. I'm a maker.
Well, I don't think anybody calls themselves contemporary art.
I bet there is someone who does when they go back to see the pinballs. There would have been people who ran around and said, I'm a modern artist. And there were, I can remember, people used to say, I'm a postmodernist, I'm a postmodern artist, whatever that was.
John, it seems that in reading some of the Hal Foster responses, there were, I think, one or two that were keen to dismiss art history or history as a sort of ethical prop for something that is only needed if one requires some kind of support for the sort of scholarship work that one engaged with in the present. So I wonder, from your perspective, what's the status of these branches? You can't hear, okay. So I'm asking John, considering some of the responses to the Hal Foster invitation to reflect on what is contemporary, what is history, invited the possibility that history and historical studies were merely an ethical prop for a continuing engagement with practice or studies of the contemporary. Why need art history? In that sense, it is simply an ethical reflexivity. But in that sense, what is the status in relation to contemporaneity of these initiatives like the restaging of when attitudes become formed, and for that matter the Fox, which you're bringing out, or even the Sam Durant reprise of the civil rights question. Do these kinds of ventures also use historic occurrences to validate some kind of uncertainty about engaging with the now, engaging with things in the present? Or is there some real validity to going back to these instances? Do they only become another instance of the spectacular in the present, which seem to be your concern with the attitudes that become formed?
It was certainly my kind of reading and concern with when attitudes become formed at the Prado Foundation. I think Sam Durant's, I think the kind of boulderdizing of a civil rights placard as a painting without any connection to or interest or care of the source of resources is a very different thing. I know with the Fox, Arnaud Desjardins and I certainly felt when we were still talking about the project before we'd actually even begun, that we felt not only that the Fox, because of its very loaded, self-critical, internecine, but a kind of openly social, critical, political self-criticism and thrust, and kind of hectoring tone, we felt like it might be a productive way to engage with now, post-2008, kind of world, where that kind of the criticality of a postmodernist theory was not yet, wasn't necessarily available to us. And so it was a way of really just putting something extant in history from a time that we feel, shares many kind of symptoms, characteristic conditions of today, of putting something out and testing, in a sense, its relevancy, usefulness. But I mean, ultimately, what's at stake is, it's a historical project. But at the same time, we have no desire to historicize the Fox. I mean, although I will be at the Getty and be going through the archives for a fourth issue, where there was a fourth issue, but it was published by Art and Language as a means of announcing their control and the death of the Fox. So Fox, they simply put the Fox on it on a cover of Art and Language, where we'll make a kind of missing Fox 4. Now, the content that'll go into it, part of which will be archival, but it'll then be the kind of the feedback, the response from the workshops, and seminars, soundings that we carry out. I think part of what, in my reading, part of what drives Foster's Questionnaire of the Contemporary is the problem of, for so much of art history, that it lacks a really effective engagement with historical material. I mean, obviously it's engaging with art history, with the history of art, but it's still not very social, in a general sense. And even that thrust of the social history of art, that seemingly passed almost more quickly than postmodernism. And postmodernist theory was meant, in a sense, to be a way of extending, that project in a sense. I mean, that said, for Hal Foster and many of the group aligned with October, have a very specific investment in promoting practices that have that kind of historical trajectory. And so for Foster, the neo-avant-garde is going to be of crucial importance so that he has access to the work that formed him as an artist. And part of his kind of grump is as much the loss of terms like the neo-avant-garde or the avant-garde as the problem of postmodernism. Osborne would come down along the lines of, like many, of a kind of wishing for a return to some sort of unfinished project involved in modernism, modernity. I could almost have been convinced of that the first time around. The problem is now I don't think the conditions are anywhere near for any, necessary for a kind of redemptive return to some sort of unfinished project of modernity, let alone modernism. It should be that scene. Marlene would exactly be able to tell people what she was up to. But it's because of, for me, this kind of intensification of exactly these kind of symptoms of what was postmodernity that one finds in the contemporary. Right? If everything was immediately made visible and available for consumption then, now you don't. It is, but you don't even have to consume it. I mean, someone else will do the consuming for us. It's almost like the kind of, there was a wonderful Saturday Night Live skit of the pre-chew diner, where Chevy Chase, you would sit down and order your big steak, and Chevy Chase would come over and chew it for you, and spit it into your mouth. All you have to do is swallow. But I don't find any, I mean, the contemporary feels like a dead end, for all its kind of projection into a future. It feels ever more like a stuck record, like very little traction. And it reminds me of, there was once, there was a young kind of undergraduate in the early 80s who had a great kind of nostalgia industry that was swirling all around. And you just were desperate for some way to advance time. Like you wouldn't have thought of, you could have fast forwarded the cassette tape, but you wouldn't have been able to skip tracks. There's just no way to get, to get forward, it seems. But now we're in a kind of perpetual present, which has, I think, as much to do with postmodernism as its projection of the contemporary. There was another potential question higher up in the clouds before we started to talk about that one.
I have a question. Was it Hal Foster you said that was complaining that art historians don't engage with historical material closely enough, or who was it?
That was more me grumping about it.
Okay. So is that what I was going to ask was?
I know, obviously they deal with historical material. It just doesn't feel maybe social.
Okay. What I was going to ask was if Hal Foster had said that, but now you could answer it even in relationship to yourself. What his presentation was then in relationship to this perhaps dilemma or this problem of not looking close enough at historical material, or even not being close enough to historical material.
Yeah.
So how would you situate this work of this sort of lecture we just?
Oh right, this is what I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
This is so contemporary in a way. Because I've thrown out a little bit of a chronology perhaps, and it's a little slight feint to a project, relating my own practice with Fox. But I have in no way kept that. Foster would respond to it as what's crucial is keeping this axis kind of balanced between time and the social, and to give in too much to one at the expense of the other is trying to balance between the two. It might be a kind of, as much as anything, a problem with thinking reception of what a truly kind of historicising talk would be, and whether that would be intelligible, palatable today, I don't know, or whether I would even necessarily be interested in doing solely that. I mean, what is your comment, stroke complaint, which originally was for Foster?
No, I'm not complaining. I was just wondering, like, what, because to me it felt like I was trying to just get out of what we just experienced in relationship to some of the not necessarily positions, but yeah, some of these things that you were saying that could be complaints, and then just so like, yeah, well, like what the hell was it? So is your response to me just now was about the axis, and then the thing before that about this is so contemporary. For you, is there no two axes? There's just response.
No, there are
okay.
two axes. You know, maybe one of the kind of the social, in a sense for me, with the attraction of a project like the Fox, is the fact that it in a sense is a really concrete manifestation of the diachronic and the synchronic together, in that it's a piece from time that it's in its original iteration was entirely social, and that to put that out today, you know, how will the time component will be read as distant, but the question is, how can it possibly begin to feel relevant? So it's a testing. You know, if I'm not saying that I know what the outcome will be. It might, you know, because it's so very little known. And if we don't willfully produce a lot of contextualizing material around it, which I'm certainly interested in doing, but not before there's a response. Because I don't want it to be misread or misrecognized as that kind of archival, archaeological, you know, a bit more like Blast, you know, when that was reissued, and it just was kind of put out as if it had already existed. Or a project, it was a fabulous project that was underfunded that Alan Ruppersberg carried out, where as part of a public art project in Arnhem, which was, Arnhem is the location of the bridge too far for the film and the actual war. And so Ruppersberg researched books which all the combatants might have been carrying around in their rucksack. So the kind of mass popular reading of the day. But it's expressly books which were forgotten or out of print. And he had them reprinted and then kind of reinserted into bookshops, European bookshops. So they just kind of found their way unannounced back out into there. And so for antiquarians and librarians, they're seeing this book, which looks, for all intents and purposes, like it's original, but it's a reprint of the thing. The problem is you can tell them apart because they could only afford to print, for many of them, the first 100 pages or so. So lots of them blank towards the latter end. That, you know, the Fox is a project I think is a little more committed to looking at the outcome rather than merely putting them out there. An act of more memorial than we had no memorial kind of drive to the beginning of the project. What's happened since the past year and a half that we've been working on it is that two of the original participants have died, which is the other thing, in a sense, the other development around art at that period is that it's now no longer kind of given one can speak directly to any of these people to generate the history or criticism that one wants. And that's turning it all over into another kind of disciplinary field. It'll by necessity be art history then and archival documentary.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't know quite exactly what I want to say, but it's got to do with the word relevance in relation to the contemporary and how, like, I remember, like, I was studying my undergrad at the time, like, when contemporary was like the buzzword, you know, and now I think that it's kind of been replaced by the word relevance, which falls into the same trap that you like the title of this talk, which is relevant to what? And I guess, like, yeah, what you know what it is, like, that I want to tease out this with, like, yeah, like your point of view, like you're kind of announcing the death of the contemporary in a sense, like saying it's, well, you're saying it's really lame. Come on, it doesn't engage with like our current like socio-economic like problems of globalization, neoliberalism. So you're saying let's move towards something that's more relevant.
Or at least recognize the fact that maybe the contemporary is the extension of postmodernism by another name.
Yeah,
You know,
that's
they're
what you're
kind of
saying.
like
Yeah.
kind of like old wine in new bottles.
And people frown upon generally postmodernism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but how come?
Because it lacks, well, just generally, I think it lacks a position.
Yeah.
That's like what I remember learning about postmodernism and then academic friends just like, oh, don't like this.
Oh no.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
So you're saying it's just come in another guise?
Well, something has, with a lot of the symptoms of the thing in the first kind of order, first circulation. You know, and it may, the answer, you know, what I might say in response is it might go back to this problem of a postmodernism left and right. You know, there were positions that were not hard fought and quite easily taken up, and therefore easily let go of. And with the contemporary, you know, for me, part of the problem is that its relevancy is given. It becomes that kind of very easy band-aid answer to what it is I do, or what Marlene does, or what is, you know, why are you going to Freeze, London, to look at contemporary art. You know, it's if that is the case, then, you know, maybe all we're ever going to have from now on is contemporary art. But eventually, you know, it'll have to be retroactively, you know, something else, you know, will have to be inserted in the place of that.
Yeah, what I'm suggesting is that relevance is like inserted into that place, right? An exhibition of relevant art as opposed to.
Yeah, but relevant, you know, relevant to what? I mean, I once, in an interview, thinking I was really getting at something, I once asked Peter Droig what would be a useful painting. And he was like, what are you talking about? You know, it's not useful at all. You know. And he wasn't about to say, oh, well, it's just market fodder. But it's, you know, it's not meant to be useful. And so he doesn't want to have any kind of relevancy.
But I think another, like, sorry, I'm stuck here, but another, like, buzzword is of the moment, and this very much falls into that, like, the relevance, and what is it relevant to? Oh, it's relevant to the moment, and, like, yeah, speaking about what is happening now, yeah, it's that similar kind of cluster.
Yeah. But what is, you know, whatever is happening now is, I mean, it's kind of already happened. So that, you know, this, I had a student graduated last year whose express project was to exploit what's happening now in a kind of critical mode and hold the mirror back up to the vampire by making it. You know, and the problem was, I tried to talk him out of it any number of times because I said, it's you're going to be like Lucy at the chocolate factory. You know, that's going to be coming down the conveyor belt so fast. You know, or if you take a holiday and you come back and you will have missed a whole body of work or something. You know, because what is now? You know, I mean, it was very, you know, there was a moment maybe 5 years ago where one, I think, could go to Frieze and you would suddenly see an awful lot of something. What's happened, you know, post-2008 is, I think, well, one thing is a lot of very blue chip, bankable, safe, medium, specific, statusy things have come back because of the market kind of investment imperative. But then, if anything else, things have become a little more intangible as far as, you know, kind of lo-fi, sculpture, kind of, you know, bling. You know, I went to Frieze, and when I was after the opening, and I was coming out, and I thought, you know, there wasn't a lot of wooey stuff there. There wasn't a lot of bling, you know, which I'd gotten really used to that kind of glam, you know, wooey kind of bubble stuff, which still was, you know, kind of filtering out through the art films. And even though I didn't see it, the problem was it was there. I didn't know what it looked like. You know, so the moment, the relevancy of, you know, there was some kind of disconnect because it had to be there. There was shelf space available for it, and they would not have an art fair without putting it up there. But somehow the look of what is bling, maybe it all migrated to Frieze Masters, but it wasn't there and apparent. Even, you know, and I'm not saying that Jeff Koons inflatable aluminium things were relevancy.
Are there any more questions?
I just have a question. You talked about postmodernism to the left and responsibly having what is the postmodernism
Well, the postmodern of the right was, everybody was kind of aware of that, even though at the same time they were denying, in fact, there might be a postmodernism of the left and right. And the right-wing stuff, you know, the right-wing stuff could have been endorsed by Julian Schnabel, or return to expressive painting kind of thing, Baselitz or Kiefer. Not to mention someone like, you know, really conservative, call to order kind of postmodernists, who were, you know, maybe trying to get everybody to behave and do the right thing as far as making in the right vein or mode, medium materials. And they're like an extreme, like in a local kind of knowledge culture, that would be someone like Brian Sewell, or somewhere else it would be someone like Hilton Kramer, even. But kind of people longing for a kind of return to the past, and kind of back to the future kind of mode. The postmodernists, right, were never, they never had a lot of, they never had a voice within postmodernist discourse. They had their own thing kind of outside of that, you know, where it's the official kind of line in literature would have been largely taken up with a kind of active left, or a kind of very passive stylistic left. You know, the people who thought you could either buy into it or not. Which is, through Jameson, I was trying to say, today there is no option. You know, it's not like you can either decide to be one or not be one. You know, it's part of a cultural logic of the way the world economy, global economy is structured, where everything will be made available, and visible at all times.
we go to March Ground again. Someone to join us there. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, it didn't. It's fine. It's like, just not really. This. I know, like a million times. Oh, it's okay. It's like, I mean, you use like reality more my question was essentially like, why the fuck do I care about it? More like, necessary way. Study historiography and so forth. But also like why the fuck like together like